He uses algorithms, data science, and mechanism design approaches to study democracy, markets, and societal systems at large. Nikhil has received the Informed George Dantzig Dissertation Award and honorable mention for the ACM SIGecom Dissertation Award, several other Best Paper Awards, and Forbes 30 Under 30 for Science. He received his PhD from Stanford University and has spent considerable time in industry. Most recently, he was the principal data scientist at PredictWise, which provides election analytics for political campaigns. So let's give a huge round of applause to Dr. Nikhil Garg, as if he has given the best talk ever.
That was probably the most enthusiastic. Is the mic necessary?
Yeah, it's for recording.
It is? Okay. Set. Okay. Yeah, I think that was probably one of the more enthusiastic welcomes I've gotten. Really happy to be here. Happy to keep this informal if folks have questions throughout. I definitely have, I adapted the standard academic talk I give about this work, but so I definitely have more content and more detail that I'm going to cover, so I'm just going to skip through a lot of stuff. And is there a way I can see a clock or something? If I just look at my watch. Okay, great. Okay, yeah, so today I'm going to talk about a bunch of work that we've been doing to try to understand, for the New Yorkers in the audience, the 3-1-1 system, and I'll explain that in a little bit, and use that, I think, as an example of the type of, hopefully impactful work that you can do in data science, in government or in public interest or in academia. And so, what's the high-level vision is that I think we're in a world with a lot of opportunity right now, in that there's these large, granular, open government data sets that are coming online and are really rich now due to especially leading in New York, open data movements in the last 10, 15 years. And that's being married with a lot of modern computational toolkits and machine learning, algorithmic fairness, optimization that brings these methods to be able to be used in these large data sets. And then there's also part of, especially in big cities, we have a lot of willing, equity-focused practitioners in government and in public interest who really want to work with people who know these people who have these tech skills that may not traditionally be working in government. I mean, New York is an exception, right? Every agency in New York has a large tech team, has people who know SQL, data analytics, and so on. But you go a few miles to a smaller city, that is probably not true anymore, right? So I think there's a lot of opportunity for people especially with technical skill sets, to make an impact, even outside or in partnership with practitioners. But what's the challenge is that if you've ever actually worked, so that's the standard open data promise that some of you have probably heard many times. But then if you actually start digging into these data sets, there's just a whole lot of complicated things going on, both within the data and just understanding the system that produced that data, right? So censoring of various kinds, distribution shifts, so things change over time. There's just a whole lot of spatio-temporal granularity, which comes with the richness, and just all of these things that if you take a standard data science toolkit, you're okay, does that actually deal with all of these problems? Can they actually understand what's going on here and make insights? And so, I think the lesson a lot of this stuff is that, I think both the opportunity and the challenges are true. And I think the opportunity is still true as long as you really dig deep to understand what's going on in a specific context, as opposed to trying to do fly-by data science and then work with domain experts. Okay, so what's the specific context that I'm going to talk about? Today, it's a potentially boring topic, but I'm trying to convince you that it's important, which is government service allocation, which is, our local government is responsible for whole bunches of things, right? So like outside of probably immigration and sort of the criminal justice system, it's probably the highest contact government that you have and highest impactful contact that you have with government is often local government and like things they do to manage your day-to-day life, right? So like in New York, there's about 8,000 miles of streets that the government needs to maintain. About 700,000 trees just lining the streets, not counting trees in parks, right? So like with parks, it's well over 1 million. Housing, sanitation, transportation, just all sorts of things that the government needs to let alone build, maintain. Right? And so like maintaining this and just like doing things is hard, right? So like they have to learn where the problems are, right? Like if a pothole appeared outside this morning, how does the government know about it, right? We don't have 24-hour video surveillance of the entire city. And even if we did, sort of we don't have the computational techniques to sort of actually learn, process that. Once I learn what problems there are, there's like the allocation problem, right? There's sort of whole bunches of problems throughout the entire city. Government budgets are not big enough to respond to everything the second it happens, right? So which ones do I address today? Which ones do I address tomorrow? And so on. And then hindsight, especially because it's public, it should be in the public interest, we care about auditing and just understanding what we did, right? Did we do a good job in these first two tasks? And when I keep saying good here, what do I mean by good? There's like both standard efficiency and equity metrics, right? So like I care about inspecting and sort of, I care about resolving the most important incidents as quickly as possible, right? If there's like an exploded fire hydrant, I should like deal with that the second it happens. If it's like a crack in the sidewalk, maybe it could take a few months, right? So like I really do care about getting to important stuff first, but I also sort of, you can formalize it in many different ways. There's like some equity notion where like, even if all like the super important things happen in one neighborhood, maybe if like marginally less important stuff you want to take care of in other neighborhoods, right? So government's responsible to the entire city as opposed to sort of just certain neighborhoods. And so how does a lot of this happen? In many cities throughout the US, over 100 cities have in the US and then more throughout the world, have what are called 311 systems or crowdsourcing systems, right? So it's called 311 when it used to primarily be a phone number, but now it's an app to complain to the local government. So after let's just do a raise. How many people in this room have heard of 311? Raise your hands. Okay. Have used it to submit at least one report. Okay, so 2, 3 reports. 5, 10, 20. Right, so like that's the standard distribution every time I do this, right? It's like a lot of people have heard of it. As soon as you ask who's made a report, especially with like a young crowd like this, okay, it goes down. And then there's like the one person who's done like 20 or 50. Right, and like in the aggregate, it's huge, right? So 3 million service requests per year. And this is like, sort of if you actually look at calls to the 311 system, it's like 30 million, but about the subset 3 million is like requests for the government to do something. So like, these are pretty big systems, and this is actually the primary way the New York City government learns about problems, right? So we don't have 24-hour surveillance of the entire city. We can only know about problems when people complain about it. Right, and I think they're really core to, in some sense, I like to say it is the largest democratic system, like sort of the most temporally sort of common democratic system we have in local government, because it's really people telling the government, here's what you should do, right? And it's not once every 6 months or every 2 years or every 4 years, it's every day. Okay. So what's the pipeline from incidents to like work getting done? At some point, some incident happens, so like a tree falls down or a pothole appears. Hopefully, at some point, we observe a 311 report. Now, that's not guaranteed, right? So like, if no one reports it, the government doesn't hear about it. And so that's about, we work a lot with the Parks Department, and so they receive about 70 to 100K reports a year. And then, it's not like there's a stereotype of government that it doesn't do anything, but like, they're incredibly responsive. So about 2/3 of reports, like at least in the Parks Department, they physically send out an inspector to the site of the report to fill out this like long form on what's actually going on. And about half the time they do that, they actually send out a maintenance crew to like fix whatever is going on. Now this is not immediate, this takes many months potentially, but it happens. And so like, why is this hard? It's like sort of, I have a lot of words here, but maybe the most important thing that we're worried about for a lot of it is sort of exactly the distribution when people raise their hand, right? Is like sort of if very few people are producing big parts of the reports, then like where they happen to live, which as you can imagine, sort of reporters might be correlated with sociodemographics, socioeconomics, sort of are driving what's getting done as opposed to like the actual incidents on the ground. And so what we want to do is we want to understand this end-to-end system and then hopefully improve it in terms of efficiency, equity, so. Okay. So I'm going to spend some amount of time, partially this is like, a talk where hopefully getting y'all excited about open data and using it. Partially it's to demonstrate the type of work that I think is sort of especially powerful, which is modeling, sort of how do you take a real world system, maybe mathematically model it or model it through sort of various data science techniques, and then use that take that to some empirical technique, whether it's PyTorch or Stan or sort of so on other things, and then actually get insight. So I'm going to spend some amount of time, maybe less than the slides imply, on sort of just one project and understanding reporting behavior, and then I'll zoom out for sort of just describe some of the other things that one can do with this data, and then that's sort of trying to span the entire pipeline. Any thoughts or questions so far? Yeah, so I'm gonna first spend a big amount of time trying to just understand this first part of this process, right? So when an incident happens, when does it generate a report, right? And where does it generate a report? Why does that matter? Because if there's disparities in this first part of the pipeline, right? So like if there's disparities in who's reporting problems, then there's going to be disparities in what work gets done and when it gets done, right? There's like, there are things the agency can do about it, but it needs to know about these disparities in the first place to address them. And this is a paper with my PhD student, Jia Liu, and Uma Vandaram, who is the Deputy Director for Data Analytics. I think that's her correct title. She's high up in the Parks Department in data science roles. I believe the official title is Deputy Director for Data Analytics in the forestry. Okay. So what's the statistical problem that we want to tackle? So what do we want to do? We want to understand disparities in who reports problems. We immediately run into a problem where how do we distinguish between this thing wasn't reported and this thing didn't happen, right? By definition, in these crowdsourcing systems, we don't observe data on incidents that didn't happen. And even if we observe data about an incident that happened, we don't observe any data on when it happened, right? We only observe data on when it was first reported, right? So like, what's an example is from just the data set, you couldn't tell me the difference between there were 10 fallen trees in this neighborhood and half were reported versus there were just 5 fallen trees in this neighborhood. But that's like precisely what we care about, right? So like, if we care, what the agency actually cares about is addressing all 10. And so when we talk about, are there disparities in, by like who's reporting and when, what we care about is trying to distinguish between these two cases. And this is called the benchmark problem, and it's it's everywhere you look when you try to do data science in any real world system, right? So there's a lot of people who care about sort of auditing the police for sort of inequitable policing, but we immediately run into the same problem. How do you disambiguate between sort of different populations, different neighborhoods, in terms of crimes committed versus the policing itself being inequitable for arrests? In healthcare, what we sort of, if all we observe is the number of diagnoses by population, how do we know that the populations were being under-tested for disease versus actually having better health? A lot of the math in this problem originates from ecology, interestingly enough, where when you're just like trying to count the number of animals somewhere, how do you disambiguate like how much I tried versus the actual amount of population there? So this is sort of a huge problem like everywhere you look at data science. And so like what are the standard ways that you can try to get around this that people typically do? They sort of try to hunt for settings where they have ground truth data on the incident rate. So like they have sensor data, or they're like, for whatever reason, I really trust that I know that like how many incidents actually happened in this population. So like in medicine, you often, this is also problematic as well. Actually, no, let me do in policing, there's this trope in policing, I'm not an expert, so I don't know how true it is, that it's like hard to hide a body, right? So like murder rates are probably pretty well estimated in different neighborhoods, but that doesn't mean like drug crimes are well estimated, right? Because whether someone's arrested for drug crime depends a lot on the police. Whether you're counting the number of murders, maybe the police don't have nearly as much discretion. So that's the basic idea, is that you try to find settings where you're like, no, I'm pretty sure I know like the ground truth, like how many things actually happen, right? And so like in this setting, it's like maybe you go out and walk the streets, and people have done this, right? So like people in 311 have spent a whole bunch of money and basically grad student time sending them out to various neighborhoods and like counting how many light bulbs are out of lamps, right? So you can 100% do this. Go out and walk the streets and get a snapshot uncensored view. Or you can like try to, I'm pretty skeptical of these methods, but like try to construct proxy methods. So like number of trees, their size, their species, and like try to like predict how many incidents there's gonna be. I think there's a whole bunch of challenges to each of these methods. I don't want to dive deep into it, but maybe the biggest one being, or one of the two biggest ones being, that like the first one's just expensive, right? So like, and you can maybe do that at one point in time for one type of incident in like a subset of neighborhoods, but you certainly can't get like a continuous snapshot view of the entire city and like over time and for every type of incident. And then maybe the other one, which I don't have on the slide, is none of this gives you any temporal information. So like, what I actually care about is if like a fire hydrant exploded, was it reported the second it exploded, or did it flood the street for 5 hours? Or if there's a crack on the sidewalk, was it first reported a day after it happened, or like 5 months later when someone finally decided to report it, right? Because like end-to-end delays is what matters for like a lot of fixing things. And so the question that we try to tackle in this work is, can we actually measure this underreporting without any notion of ground truth? So without constructing proxy measures or like spending any grad student money on walking the streets. They don't like to walk the streets. Okay, so what's the key idea? The key idea is actually comes from the ecology literature as well. We have to modify it, as I'll go into in a tiny bit, is there's actually secret information hidden in the data sets, which is how many duplicate reports you get about the same incident, right? So it turns out that like there's some incidents that get like hundreds of reports within like a few hours of it happening. This is often, again, the exploded fire hydrants that keep going back to. And there's some incidents that are like, whatever, maybe one report ever, and so on, right? So, and the idea is that the first report about an incident just tells you the incident exists, right? Because, often, we have the assumption that someone's not going to report something that's not there. And then the rest of the reports tell you something about how often it gets reported, conditional on existing. We have to like change this a little bit as the existing methods, because like things in our setting the original method was developed in ecology where like and like with the assumption being that things don't go extinct or new species aren't like generated while you're counting. That's clearly not happening here. Clearly here, things are happening and getting fixed over time. And so what we do here is we develop a method and then apply it to understanding street tree incidents in New York. I'm going to blaze through the model and methods. I'm maybe going to spend a little bit of time on the model, purely as sort of, I think maybe a lot of this audience has sort of, might not have seen sort of this way of like, here's how to take a real world setting and then mathematically model it in a way that then tells you what data science to do, as opposed to like immediately running to like doing a regression of some kind. And so often in this way of thinking, what we really, really spend a lot of time thinking about is what is the actual process that generated the data? And then how do we mathematize that process in a way that we can then estimate the things that we care about? And so I'm going to have, I'm going to sort of use the plain language way to describe a lot of this, because it's fairly simple. So what we have is we have many types of incidents. There's trees, there's potholes, there's this location, that location, so on. And these happen over time, right? Incidents of various types just happen over time. And then, so take one incident, it happens. We don't observe when it happens. And then there's some other process in which, conditional on the incident happening, it gets observed and reported to the agency through the 311 system, right? So at some point in time, so this is time, the incident happens, some unknown delay later, it first gets reported. And then maybe it actually gets reported a second time and a third time and so on. And the black line is that like saying that we actually observe this time, right? We get a timestamp for the first report, and so we observe this delay for the second report and third report and so on. At some point, it might be inspected by the agency. And then at some unknown time and partially unknown, the incident disappears, right? Either fixed by the agency or a Good Samaritan, or like if it's like a branch on the sidewalk, it washes away or whatever. And what we care about, unfortunately, is understanding this time, right? What we actually care about is how long did it take for the incident to first get reported. Now that's the one thing we don't have in this system, right? Because this is the reporting delay that just like is a lower bound on how quickly something can get fixed. If the agency doesn't know about it until 7 days later, even if they fix it the millisecond they hear about it, it's going to take 7 days from when it happening.
Sorry, this is a bit technical, but I was just wondering if you can justify whether the post-op process is a conflict of the data, because it looks like it is a series of exponential clock.
Yeah, so let's talk about this offline. The answer is the answer is that you need sort of what's called a zero inflated Poisson, and that ends up being an incredibly good fit of the data. But we can talk about detail offline. Okay. All right. So this is the estimate that we care about, and it matters, but it's also the one thing we don't have in the system, right? And like we know there's heterogeneity here, right? Like we know more dangerous incidents are reported quicker. We want that to happen, but we also suspect that that time is dependent by neighborhood, and maybe dependent by socioeconomics of the neighborhood, right? And so this time is longer, maybe in some neighborhoods and others. Sort of maybe a preview of the results. So I just moved to the Upper West Side last week, and the sort of like no matter how we cut it, we have several different projects and several different methods. The Upper West Side and Columbia in particular, near Columbia, is just like the highest report. Like everyone in the Upper West Side and Columbia reports. It's just like no matter how you measure it, it's just like incredibly high reporting rates. Okay. Anyway, I'll skip a lot of the detail, but maybe the insight, the central insight in the work is like, okay, what we actually care about is the delay between the incident occurring in the first report. We don't have that, but what we do have is the delays between the first report and the second report, and the second report and the third report, and maybe sort of the third report and like the incident getting fixed or whatever, right? If we observe that. Now, you might just be tempted to be like, okay, I can just take like these numbers as a proxy for this number. You have to be slightly more careful about that, but sort of that's essentially the idea. Just use the delay between the first and second report sort of as a proxy. Now, there's a whole bunch of math to show when you can do that. I'm not going to get into that, but it turns out that you can then you can do that and then essentially run what's called a Poisson regression, a fancy regression, to do that.
Was there any point where you, for certain incidents, that you actually can estimate based on other factors when they happen, and you can use that to help you figure the general trend?
That's a good question. We haven't looked into that. It's hard to know what kind of incidents that would be, at least in sort of in the public data for like knowing when it actually happened.
I just had a thought. Is there any interest in like creating incidents? Could there be an experimental setting where you have a control? I don't know if this is ego, but
no, I think that's a great point, right? It's sort of all I'm like, sort of everything I'm talking about so far is like observational data science. Sort of, I observe a data set and then I try to back out what happened. And there's like another extremely powerful sort of method that every sort of type of work, which is experimental, right? Is you go out and run an experiment. And you observe what happened, or you try to leverage what's called natural experiments, like nature caused an experiment of some kind, and sort of we have other projects that we're not causing incidents. Like, I think that's like an ethical sort of red line, but we have other what you can potentially do is sort of, and what we're trying to do in one project now is work with the agency in changing how they're responding to various things, and then try to understand the impact of those changes.
So I would assume that a lot of 311 reports, there's maybe only one report for an incident.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, did you have to get rid of those cases, or how you built a distribution when there's only one report?
That's a good question. So that relates to his question, where sort of we needed to modify the I showed a simplified model of the world. We needed to modify that a little bit to take care of the zeros there where you don't observe duplicates. But we definitely don't throw away that data, because that data is incredibly useful, right? So if you're never observing any duplicate information in a neighborhood, and they probably have low reporting rates, right? If you never got a second one, you got lucky on the first one. But if you got 10, then you didn't get lucky on the first. So yeah, you cannot throw that away. Okay, so we use basically completely New York City open data. We work with the Parks Department, and so they gave us some additional data to filter out duplicates by the same person, because like a subtle assumption in our method is it can't be by the same person. And so we use about 200,000 service requests over a 3-year period. And we have pretty rich covariance. So latitude, longitude, we have the report characteristics like hazard, sidewalk damage, blah, blah, blah. And then we also have the inspector report. So when the inspector went out, what was the risk rating, what was the condition of the tree, what was the tree ID, and so on. And we ended up duplicating the entire thing in Chicago because they also sort of have very rich 311 data on that. Okay, let's skip this. So what do we find? So this is kind of just a sanity check that the method works, which is more dangerous things get reported more, right? If this wasn't estimated, then you'd probably be doubting the method, right? So things that are labeled as hazards are reported much faster. Things that are roots or sidewalk issues, like cracks under the ground, basically no one reports. Trees in excellent condition sort of are reported slower, and so on, right? And so I'll contextualize this on the next slide, but essentially, so hazards are reported 3 to 7 times faster than other things. maybe on the other side, there's also huge spatial heterogeneity, right? So here's the Upper West Side, Columbia area. Right, so reporting also varies substantially by neighborhood, even conditional on incident characteristics. So this is like taking out the impact of like maybe hazards are distributed unevenly in different locations. Right, and like the difference between the census tracts can be like about at the same scale as the difference between hazards and non-hazards. Right, so it's like pretty huge heterogeneity, and it unfortunately varies by socioeconomic characteristics in the direction you might expect. And so for those of you who don't speak regression coefficients, sort of what does that contextualize in terms of average delay? So like if there's a hazard, the tree's in poor condition, the inspector labels it as high risk, like in Manhattan, you can expect a delay of about a day or two, in Queens about 5 days. And if it's like slightly less urgent, there's some tree damage, poor condition, but it's not about to fall down, 15 days and 28 days. And then a root, sewer, sidewalk issue that like basically no one observes, hundreds of days. And this is just reading off of our regression coefficients. And then maybe sort of I'll end here, or sort of this, and then I'll summarize takeaways in a second, is this is, like I said, the reporting delay is just one stage of the process, right? Like you need a report, and then there's a delay in inspection, and then there's a delay in work order, right? And so this is just taking for like the especially highest priority incidents, so like taking the incidents that like the agency is like, yes, we need to fix this as soon as possible. Like what did we estimate as the reporting delay versus what was the subsequent agency's delay in actually addressing the thing. And what's interesting is sort of you have both this like compounding and mitigating inequity if you look over stages. So like Manhattan both reports these incidents extremely quickly, and then the agency responds immediately, right? Like the inspection happens the same day, and then maintenance happens the same day. Brooklyn, sort of you have like fairly low slow reporting, but as soon as the agency hears about it, it's like a day or two to resolve it, and so like overall delays are pretty good. But then sort of in the Bronx or Queens, it's like, sort of Queens especially, it's like slow reporting, but then compounded by slow resolution. And so that like leads to pretty high end-to-end disparities.
So why does Staten Island response rate, or why do they have such a delay? Do you know?
Well, so that's what we're working on. So it turns out like trying to understand why this happens is as tricky as trying to estimate this in the first, sort of estimating sort of these. So in the reporting thing, we just had to do all of this math to like even get this bar, right? To like, is this bar 4 days or 1 day? For work order delays, getting this bar is easy. You just like look at the data set and you like calculate medians. But then trying to understand why that happens. Is it like low budget? Is it sort of they're allocating incorrectly? All sorts of things. Sort of that ends up being another whole tricky problem that we're working on now. Right, so I'll skip that, but sort of that's essentially what we're doing now, which is like trying to understand sort of how, like why these are happening, right? So like, is it, like I said, budget, or is it just like I have a set of incidents and the foresters aren't prioritizing the most urgent ones within a neighborhood correctly? A hypothesis that the agency has is that I will not say this. Is this being recorded? This is, right? Okay. No. Right, so there's many possible things that we can talk about of like various hypotheses. I'll maybe sort of end here. I had a really star undergrad in my lab this summer for Bernard Anum, who sort of took our research and has been building this dashboard for the agency that sort of so that their borough managers can actually understand, like, here's sort of like how many service requests I did, like were created recently. Here's how many I inspected, and here's how many I worked on. Here's how that varies by neighborhood and over time, and all sorts of things. They're like really sort of take what we're doing in research and try to sort of put in front of the people making the actual on-the-ground decisions and trying to understand how their agency or sub-agency is performing. And so maybe in the last minute or two, sort of just talk about some takeaways. In orange is like what I have as the standard takeaways and giving it to sort of the standard academic audience, which is, but I think really important for here too, is that it's like, sort of, it's these standard data sets, the fact that they're open, you can like go and download all, whatever, 30 million requests for service from 311 going back to 2010, like right now, it might take a few minutes, but like, you know, you could do it. Makes it really tempting sort of to do flyby data science, right? To like download the data set and being like, let me just run some regressions or sort of plot some things and like, look, I'm making impact. But like, you really need to understand the actual data generation process and sort of how that might complicate the types of analyses and the insights that you're drawing from just looking at the raw data. And there's like, just like no way around it than either becoming a domain expert or working with someone who has one. But it's sort of, that's not to discourage people from, you know, I think part of why this open data exists is to encourage people from the outside to use it. And I think that's super valuable, but sort of, you just need some modesty and sort of what are you actually finding. And then sort of, I have a whole bunch of blue things that I thought sort of this might be useful for this audience. Is first of all is like, you know, I think there's sometimes this tendency to think that like sort of a lot of, you know, public interest stuff might be overcrowded and that like, you know, everyone's already working in criminal justice or sort of medicine or some of these like super high profile domains, but there's a whole bunch of important work out there that needs to get done by people with this skill set. So actually the grad student on the project that I talked about today interned at the New York Public Library this summer, sort of trying to understand how like, basically trying to do efficiency and equity data science and operations for sort of how sort of books move around the library system. Right, so I think there's a lot of super high impact domains out there that are understudied and sort of need people like you. And I think there's roles for everyone. So I mean, by the types of things I do, I tend to focus on like data science and optimization and machine learning. But like, you know, there's really need for full stack developers, front end people to go out and then do qualitative interviews of sort of like how do various agency employees use data, and then how, like sort of what kind of tools do they need to improve their decision making. And then lastly, I'll just do this plug, which is, I think again, you know, it's easy to be cynical about government. It's also easy to be cynical about academia, that the reward systems are messed up and sort of it's not the place to do impactful work and blah, blah, blah. And like, I think that's somewhat true, but so first I'll say that it's changing, right? So I think it's changing to support and reward this type of work. Rapidly changing or slowly changing. And so I didn't put either. But like, so like 7 years ago, you know, when I started doing this sort of stuff about 7 years ago versus now, there's like a huge number of new conferences, and every machine learning or data science conference now has a social impact track. There's a huge bunch of new communities, sort of with a lot of people's hard work, a lot of leaders' hard work to create these sort of support structures. And I think now is like sort of a great time to sort of do this sort of work in academia. So I think it depends on the place again, but I think there's a whole bunch of pockets that support and reward this type of work for those of you interested. Okay, that's sort of all I have.
Hearing your talk, for sharing about your research and kind of also giving us a little overview of how you was set up for a manual problem like this. And I'm curious about, I'll kick off the Q&A. I'm curious about, so your research of this problem also collaborates with the city. How does that collaboration come around? And how, I know in your work you collaborate actually on quite a few problems of different settings, like relating to like sometimes also school admission and like ranking and these things. Like how do they approach you? Do you approach them? How do you find these collaboration that has kind of these more real world implications?
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of there's no one answer there, and like sort of, I think one is you just have to like throw a whole bunch of sort of, you have to try many things, and sort of my advisor liked to call them 10% conversations, where like sort of it's not that 10% of these conversations lead to a collaboration, but 10% of these conversations lead to a non-trivial follow-up. So like lead to the, right? So like I think sort of it's easy to see sort of, you know, people doing this sort of work and being like, wow, they have all these collaborations, but then sort of under the hood, it's like there were like 10 times more attempts that like didn't pan out for all sorts of good reasons. And I think the ones that do sort of, I think there's an incredibly large number of models that end up working. So like sometimes it is sort of people email you. Often it is, it's like, you know, not a cold email, but a warm email. So I'm lucky enough to be at a place, Cornell Tech, that sort of was really built. So, okay, let me back up. And I didn't know about Cornell Tech until I applied for a job there, so I'm not going to say that. So Cornell Tech is, the idea came about 11, 12 years ago. It's on Roosevelt Island. It's a graduate-only institution focused on sort of tech and data science, so the computer science, operations research where I am, and then information science, master's and PhD programs, and it's essentially Cornell's campus in New York City now for graduate only. And really the vision when it was built was a campus that engages with the city and government and sort of companies and sort of like breaks out of the ivory tower. And so I think part of sort of one of the reasons why I decided to go there and is like there's just a lot of sort of people there who either go in and out of government or who have contacts or sort of can do the warm emails. So a few of my collaborations are sort of, you know, I think warm emails work a lot better than cold emails. Sorry, warm emails being like someone you know someone and they send the introduction. And some of it's cold emails, some of it's them approaching you, and then you know you have many conversations and very few of them pan out.
Thank you. Any more questions from the audience?
Hi, so I have a question is surrounding like for anyone who's interested in pursuing like data science or like a machine learning kind of path, but don't necessarily want to go to like say grad school or professional kind of setting. What kind of recommendations do you have for those folks who look to kind of create applications for impact and for social good?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's sort of, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of sort of community organization, sort of, I would just talk to the people who sort of have contacts with collaborators. So like in New York City, a big one, an organization I really like is Beta NYC, where sort of they do a lot of community work, a lot of tech work, and sort of build various tools for community boards and things like that. There's, you know, Code for America, right? Like, I think there's a whole bunch of support organizations out there now, again, that sort of maybe weren't as big about 10, 15 years ago, that are exactly designed for people like what you just described to do impactful work. And so I would try to find them. I would sort of, you know, New York has, you know, partially run by Beta NYC, has Open Data Week every year, sort of go to that, or just sort of look at the organizations there, try to sort of be part of them.
Thank you so much for your talk. It's very, very interesting. I have a question that also troubles me a lot.
So a lot of time when you work with the governments on this type of data science problems, it is always a good start to like find where the problems are, right? To find out what the data tells you. But oftentimes they also ask you like what to do next. I feel like for those analysis, like especially those like pre-new policy analysis, it seems challenging, you know, how people from like more traditional statistical or like data science background to like tackle those problems. And I was wondering whether your research ties to that and what you see as the biggest challenge on that. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. I'll give a two-part answer. So one is like a plug for the type of work I do, which is also in a department maybe many of you haven't heard of, operations research. But it's like trying to sort of do more modeling techniques for decision making as opposed to sort of obviously informed by the data and the statistics, but then how do you sort of turn that into like queue optimization? I'm going to work on this instead of that, or like various policies, things